In a small town where rumors spread faster than light, Amina, a dedicated and respected Black nurse, found herself abruptly thrust into the heart of an unprecedented judicial scandal. Accused of the tragic murder of a newborn in the hospital where she had worked for years, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of a retrial, as if every moment of her life and dedication had been erased with a single stroke. From the very first day, Amina proclaimed her innocence with desperate conviction, repeatedly asserting that she had never harmed a patient. But her voice hit a wall of prejudice and hasty judgments, silenced by the suspicions and mistrust that her origins and skin color seemed to provoke in her accusers. In this small town, public opinion turned against her with unrelenting cruelty. Fueled by sensationalist newspaper articles, the townspeople discussed her case as a tragic spectacle, each one offering sharp opinion, a devastating comment. The accusatory headlines, insinuations, and sordid rumors poisoned the atmosphere, shaping public opinion long before evidence was examined. The whispers persisted in the streets, in the cafes, and even in the corridors of the hospital. Neighbors who had known her forever, colleagues with whom she shared exhausting days, and even some members of her own community all seemed to consider her guilty, their judgment influenced more by her appearance than by concrete facts. For the local press, the case was a goldmine, a sordid story whose details were constantly exaggerated to captivate readers. With each new article, Amina's image grew darker, transforming her into a monster in the eyes of those who, the day before, would have described her as a kind and loving woman. This unfair portrayal was built and reinforced, for in this town, Amina's skin color weighed heavily on the scales of public opinion. In just a few weeks, her reputation was crushed by stereotypes and prejudice, and no one seemed willing to listen to her truth. Yet, the evidence against Amina was fragile, almost non-existent, relying more on suspicions amplified by rumors than on tangible certainties. No fingerprints, no direct witnesses, nothing that could solidly incriminate her in this tragedy that had shaken the hospital and the entire town. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the judicial system, tainted by deeply ingrained prejudice and preconceived notions, seemed to have already made its verdict before the trial had even ended. Justice, supposed to be impartial, appeared blinded by stereotypes and silent but ever-present beliefs, and Amina's innocence meant nothing in the face of the insidious whispers that had already condemned her. The defense witnesses, former colleagues who had worked alongside her for years and who testified to her integrity and competence, were met with cold indifference. Dozens of patients and their families, who could attest to the attentive care she had given them, stayed away, fearful of becoming involved in an explosive case. Her years of impeccable service, her sacrifices, and her loyalty to the hospital were of no value in the face of the implacable machine of stereotypes. It was no longer Amina, the respected nurse, who was being judged, but a distorted image fueled by fear and mistrust of differences. The few who dared to defend her immediately found themselves under the spotlight of suspicion. Some of her relatives and a few friends tried to speak on her behalf, but they were quickly silenced, either out of fear of retaliation or of being ostracized themselves. Colleagues who could have testified to her professionalism and humanity hesitated, fearing for their own careers and reputations. In this poisoned atmosphere, even the voices of support seemed muffled, swept away by a tide of prejudice that left no room for empathy. Isolated and terrified by the injustice that struck her, Amina drew on her courage to endure the constant isolation and contempt surrounding her. She found herself alone, abandoned by a world that had once applauded her devotion but now turned its gaze away. In her cell, her nights were filled with painful memories of her life before, the faces of grateful patients, the laughter shared with colleagues. But today, these memories only heightened the feeling of injustice that gripped her. Despite the anguish that gnawed at her, Amina continued to hope, almost desperately, that the truth would eventually triumph. She spent her nights writing poignant letters to her family and friends, telling them of her nightmare, trying to express the incomprehensible, and sharing her hopes, however faint they may be. In each word, she drew a bit of strength, clinging to the idea that one day, perhaps, someone would read these letters and decide to fight for her, to question the deceptive evidence that had condemned her. Her faith in the possibility of true justice remained fragile, wavering, but she refused to let it die. Amina knew that in this battle, she could only count on herself and on the faint hope that kept her head high despite the coldness of a system that seemed to have abandoned her, condemned her long before giving her a chance to prove her innocence. On the day of her final sentence, Amina was brought before the court, under the hostile gazes of a crowd eager for her condemnation. The faces of the jurors and spectators were frozen in icy contempt, animated by a mix of anger and blind certainty. The tension was so thick that every breath seemed to echo in the room, as if everyone was waiting for this moment to feed on Amina's humiliation. Handcuffed and surrounded by guards, Amina stood tall. She did not lower her eyes or head. Her gaze remained proud, reflecting an inner strength that transcended the walls of the courtroom. The judge, a grave man, prepared to pronounce the sentence. But before that, Amina was allowed to speak. This moment, she had awaited with silent pain and deep resolve. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if to gather the weight of all the injustices she had suffered, then lifted her head, her gaze sweeping the room, touching each person present. When she spoke, her voice was firm and gentle, imbued with indomitable dignity. "I have never harmed this child. I cared for him with all the heart and attention I would have given my own son. I loved him as if he were my own blood, because that is how I see every patient I have the privilege of caring for. But today, I stand before you, accused of a crime I did not commit.
And I know why.
I know that the truth is not what matters to you, but the ease of designating an ideal culprit." A murmur swept through the room, surprised by Amina's assurance, this woman to whom everything seemed destined to be taken. Yet, she continued unshaken. "What I want you to know is that the truth will eventually come to light. It is like a light that cannot be extinguished, even in the deepest darkness. And even if I have to spend years in prison, even if my voice must rise behind bars, I will never give up. Know this. I am not the guilty one, but someone, right here in this room, knows the truth and is hiding it, hoping that I will serve as a scapegoat." At that moment, her gaze, intense and piercing, turns toward the back of the room, where the hospital director, an influential man whose authority and power over the community are indisputable, stands. Until this moment, he had been watching the trial with a cold detachment, as though merely observing the procedure. But upon locking eyes with Amina's unwavering gaze, something in him wavers. He tries to look away, but the discomfort betrays him. His jaw clenches, his hands tighten, and a shadow of worry clouds his features, breaking his impassive facade. The silence in the room has become suffocating, each spectator holding their breath, as though frozen in a suspension of doubts and suspicions. Low murmurs ripple through the room, subtle but growing louder. Eyes turn toward the man, followed by whispers that rise, disturbing the previously uniform atmosphere of the room, which had been inclined to condemn Amina. Some jurors exchange perplexed glances. They begin to feel a doubt that had no place here, a doubt awakened by this simple, silent confrontation. Sensing the discomfort in the atmosphere, the judge, who had been confident in the strength of the case, seems to lose some of his certainty. He scans the hospital director, paying close attention to his palpable unease, his sudden loss of composure. Slowly, as if an invisible truth were trying to break through the layers of prejudice and hasty certainty, he becomes aware that something important may be slipping through his fingers. The echo of Amina's words still rings in his mind. "I am not the guilty one, but the one who, right here in this room, knows the truth and is hiding it." The spectator's attention is now divided between Amina and this influential man, whose face has become pale, almost livid. The atmosphere takes on a latent scandalous hue, as if the truth is about to emerge, ready to shatter the foundations of the trial. Suddenly, the judge, in a grave tone, announces an unexpected adjournment. His gavel strikes with authority, and his voice resonates in the room. "In the interest of justice, and in light of the circumstances, I decree the immediate suspension of this hearing. The court orders the reopening of the investigation. A ripple of incredulity and excitement spreads through the room. This unexpected decision resonates like a shockwave. The murmurs turn into fevered discussions, each person trying to make sense of what just happened. Amina's family members, present in the room, sit up, their hearts filled with a sudden and unexpected hope. In their eyes, the promise of justice seems not as inaccessible as they once thought. As for the hospital director, he exits the courtroom under the heavy gaze of the assembly. His once confident stride is now slow, almost hesitant. His closed expression can no longer conceal the anxiety setting in, and each step echoes in the hallway, like the death knell of his own downfall. The gazes that once greeted him with respect are now filled with distrust and suspicion, and some already whisper, speculating about his involvement in this tragedy. He knows that his power, which he thought unshakable, is starting to crack under the weight of this new suspicion. The security provided by his alliances and influence in the city no longer seems as solid. This trial, which he thought he had control over, has just taken an unexpected turn, and he feels a wave of panic rising within him. Outside the courtroom, journalists stir, sensing a scandal. Cameras are trained on the hospital director, and flashes go off as he tries to make his way through the crowd. Some call out to him, daring to ask questions he cannot answer, questions he had previously avoided thanks to his status. Tension rises, and the whispers intensify, like a rumor ready to explode. For the first time, he realizes that the shadow of the truth may soon catch up with him. Meanwhile, Amina is escorted back to her cell, the handcuffs still on her wrists. Yet, something has changed within her. She walks with her head held high, her gaze resolute, filled with a new strength. The fatigue and despair that had nearly overwhelmed her dissipate, replaced by a renewed energy. The words she spoke in the courtroom still echo within her, like a silent promise she made to herself. She has planted doubt. She knows it, and that doubt could be her key to freedom. As she is escorted through the dark prison corridors, Amina reflects on all that she has lost, but also on all that she could regain. She is aware that the path will be long, fraught with obstacles, and that justice is not won without a fight. But this time, she has hope. A faint hope, certainly, but enough to reignite the flame she thought had gone out. She knows that outside, her family, her friends, and perhaps even some strangers are beginning to believe in her innocence. And this renewed faith is the greatest strength she can have to face the dark days that still await her. Amina's final words, filled with dignity and conviction, resonate as a call for justice, triggering an unexpected turning point in the case. Stirred by the strength and clarity of her words, a detective who had been quietly observing until now decides to discreetly resume the investigation, convinced that crucial elements have been overlooked. His instinct leads him to revisit the medical records, the hospital logs, and to re-interview the staff, but this time, without the pressure of an investigation already biased in a particular direction. As he continued his investigation, he discovered glaring anomalies, security protocols ignored, medical equipment in poor condition, and incidents of contamination covered up to protect the reputation of the facility. These oversights, hidden by falsified reports, had led to complications in neonatal care. The hospital chief, fearing the tarnishing of his career and influence in the city, had orchestrated this entire ruse, choosing Amina as the perfect scapegoat, counting on the prejudices of some to support his version of events. The detective's revelations sent shockwaves through the community. Newspapers, once quick to condemn Amina without solid evidence, launched a series of articles exposing the flaws in the hospital system and the manipulations of the hospital chief. The trial was reopened, and the damning evidence uncovered by the detective led to Amina's full exoneration. The hospital chief, unmasked, was arrested for fraud, abuse of power, and the deliberate endangerment of others' lives. Finally free, Amina left the prison, her heart racing and eyes glistening with tears. She was surrounded by her family, loyal friends, and many residents of the town who, overcome with remorse, recognized the injustice they had put her through. Cheers and applause filled the air, But for Amina, it was the faces of those she loved, those who had believed in her despite the storm. Her children, whom she hadn't seen in months, rushed to her, and in their arms, she finally found some peace after years of struggle. This moment of liberation was filled with emotion, symbolizing the victory of truth over prejudice, resilience over slander. The echoes of past injustice resonated in the hearts of the people, who began to understand the depth of Amina's suffering. Her rehabilitation became a pivotal moment in the fight against systemic injustices, proof that even in the face of oppression and slander, the truth eventually prevails. Amina, with her dignity intact, became much more than a mere victim. She became a beacon, a symbol of inner strength and perseverance in the face of adversity. Now a figure of courage and truth, Amina was invited to speak in numerous schools, churches, and public forums to share her story and raise awareness about the importance of justice, but also the need to stay vigilant against hasty judgments and prejudices. Her speeches, filled with wisdom and compassion, deeply touched those who listened. With each intervention, she encouraged citizens to question the injustices they had long considered inevitable, to open their eyes to the invisible mechanisms of oppression, and to fight for a fairer world. Students listened intently, and her words echoed through school hallways, in churches where sermons became calls to action. Young people, inspired by her courage, began to get involved in social causes, denouncing discrimination and fighting for truth in their own communities. The city, shaken by the case, finally looked at itself in the mirror. Reforms were implemented in local institutions, with a concrete commitment to prevent other innocent people from suffering the same fate. Judicial procedures were reassessed, and an independent committee was created to ensure that accusations and trials were carried out fairly, without outside influence or bias. The detective, discreet and humble, remained in the background, observing the changes from afar. He was content to know that he had played a key role in this victory of truth, but he sought no glory. For him, his satisfaction lay in knowing that the injustice had been corrected and that Amina had regained her freedom. He understood that the real triumph was not in public recognition but in the certainty that he had acted according to his conscience and belief in justice. Amina, now rehabilitated, found a life marked by the recognition and respect she deserved. The townspeople, once so quick to condemn her, now hailed her as a model of dignity, courage, and unwavering resilience. The scars of her past would never fully disappear, but they were now part of the story of a woman who refused to submit to injustice. She had become the embodiment of quiet strength, a role model for all those who, like her, fight for truth and for a world where justice is not a privilege, but a universal right.